we'll start the slideshow from the beginning. So welcome. I am Angela Weisl, as Sandro said, and I am the English department's medievalist. And therefore, I'm very interested in the intersection of the past and the present. So I'm particularly interested in thinking right now about the Black Death or the bubonic plague. One of the things that always strikes me is that people, all right, now my PowerPoint's not advancing, and it was doing so well before. Now, next slide. All right, we'll try that way. Thank you. So one thing that has struck me a lot in hearing people talking about the current moment is that it's unprecedented. And of course, as a scholar of the past, I know that what's really unprecedented is the last 100 years in which we haven't had a major pandemic since the 1918 flu. And if you look back at history, really, it's a sort of movement from one to the next to the next. And people really dealt with them in ways that are very similar. So let me give you a little introduction to perhaps the deadliest of history's pandemics, the Black Death or bubonic plague. So this was the deadliest pandemic in human history, and it killed a lot of people. We tend to think of this as a story about Europe, where a third of the population was killed by the plague, but really this was a plague that was global. It killed about somewhere between 75 and 200 million people in Asia, where the plague began, Africa, and Europe. And it reminds us of how connected this world is across this sort of large set of continents that are linked to each other. It's caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. People thought that, or think that it sort of mutated into a particularly virulent form. It's a bacterium that's been around for as long as human history and continues to be with us today. But in its particularly bad versions, there were 3 varieties: the bubonic, which is the most common, which is characterized by large boils growing on the body, usually in the neck, the armpit, or the groin. And those the skin turns black, which is why it's known also as the Black Death. The pneumonic version, which is the most deadly and lands in the lungs, and the septicemic version, which is a bloodborne version. It was the least common of the versions, bubonic, of course, being the most. And it was carried by black rats. Or fleas, actually, on the black rats that spread it. It was spread primarily by fleas and by aerosols, which we know about now, of course, because of COVID. But one of the reasons that when you think about rats now, the rats that you see in the subways or other places you really don't want them to be, are brown rats or Norway rats. And part of the reason that population exploded was that the black rats, who were carriers, then often died of the plague, whereas the brown rats did not for some reason. And so they have now populated the globe. As far as we understand it, this particular emanation of Yersinia pestis began in Asia and traveled along the Silk routes to Africa and to Europe. And it was spread by rats. So this is a wonderful picture from a manuscript referencing the spreading of rats by sea. Plague ships would turn up filled with dead bodies and lots of rats. And so this is an image of that. And, you know, I love medieval illuminations, so I hope you enjoy those too. So what we really discovered more recently about this particular plague was that it first infected humans in Europe and Asia in the late Neolithic and the early Bronze Age, so a very long time ago. They've actually found Yersinia pestis bacterium in an ancient tomb. There was a big decline in Neolithic populations around the year 3000 before the Common Era, particularly in Europe, and this seems to have been the potential cause of that. The first place we see symptoms described are in Rufus of Ephesus's Chronicle, and they suggest that it had appeared in the Roman Empire and was the cause of the plague of Justinian, which happened between 541 and 542 Common Era, with kind of reoccurrences for another 200 years. And that's sometimes referred to as the first plague pandemic. So you can see that this happens over and over again. One of the things I think that's really important for us to think about is the way that the bubonic plague, like COVID, is really an example of globalization and the connectedness of peoples. It begins in China, it passed along trade routes through the establishment of the Mongol Empire, which really unites all of the countries along the Silk Road to a kind of single trade organization. And so if you trace it, you can see that there are outbreaks in Asia, then the Middle East, then it moves down into Africa and across to Europe. and of course does devastating result on the population. And one of the things I think people know about the plague is that it fueled popular anti-Semitism in Europe. Even though the Pope said the Jews had nothing to do with it, it was not poisoned wells, this was one of the forces that drove a lot of the Jewish population of Europe into Eastern Europe, particularly into Poland, where they were then at the mercy of the Cossacks many, many centuries later. It also led to a lot of changes in the world. And I think that's one of the things we want to be thinking about now in our own situation, what some of these changes may be. And one of the most obvious is actually the change in the economic system. Europe was feudal primarily. It was an economy based on land. One of the effects of the plague, because of what happened to the people who worked the land, was the rise of an economy based on money and capitalism. With it comes some rise of workers' rights, social mobility, and some people feel like that it led to the conditions of the Renaissance, particularly the move outward from Europe and colonization. And interestingly, recent research has also suggested that it may have led to a very interesting climate event, which was the Little Ice Age of the 16th and 17th century, where Europe, which had been quite warm, they grew grapes in England, which is sort of hard to imagine. Although I don't know that the wine was very good, but they made it. But then after that, there was a big kind of cooling period that led to an ice age. People used to think, before there was much climatological study, that those Dutch paintings of people ice skating on the canals were fantasies, but actually the canals froze pretty regularly during this little ice age period. And some of this came from depopulation and the absence of labor allowed land to be restored. And I think some of the ways we might think about the connections to the current moment, I hope you all read or noticed that when Italy had to shut down and tourist ships stopped, or cruise ships stopped coming into Venice, that the water started getting much cleaner pretty quickly, and then the dolphins started coming back to Venice. So we can see that this can happen fairly quickly, that people's relationships to population and population's relationship to the land and what happens to it and the climate is really vitally important. One of my favorite fascinating facts about the Little Ice Age and the medieval cooling period after the warming period is that there was a fairly large colony in Greenland, a Norse colony in Greenland, and it's those folks who came and discovered or landed on the north coast of North America into what they called Vinland and Markland, which they now know is sort of northern Canada, Labrador and Newfoundland. Was that because of the warming period, that was very easy to live in Greenland. You could farm, you could have livestock, and then everything basically got much colder and the population essentially, first they went crazy and then they froze. But we can talk about that later. In any case, a few more facts. This bacterium is still around. There was a recent outbreak in Madagascar in 2017, but it's now very easily treated with antibiotics. In fact, it responds very well to the first antibiotic, penicillin. And that one of the ways it's still carried is that fleas on prairie dogs in the American West are infected, and cases still emerge periodically there. But if you come back from a visit to Montana or the Dakotas or Wyoming, and you aren't feeling well, you might mention to your doctor that you possibly have bubonic plague, which might freak them out a little. One of the things that's interesting too to think about in the plague epidemic is medieval medical beliefs and how they influenced people to think about it and to influence their treatments. Throughout the medical world, the idea of the body in balance really drove medicine. We know some of this from thinking about yin and yang still in China. In India, it was called the 7 elements. In Europe, the 4 humors. And if you poke around on the internet, there are all of these 4 humors quizzes and 4 temperaments quizzes based on these philosophies. Treatments that are still used, such as acupuncture, leeching, and purging, were designed to bring these elements into balance. Obviously, people still use acupuncture now, not so much purging, other than if you swallow poison, but leeching, interestingly enough, with the application of actual leeches, is still used in reattachment surgery because they're very effective for reducing blood pooling. So that medical treatment was actually not completely cuckoo. It was really useful. What they knew about disease was interesting. They thought that there were seeds of disease that entered the body in various ways that caused sickness. And they knew that the plague was a seed that entered the body. They knew it came from animals, although they didn't always get the animal right. So there were mass killings. The horses, we mentioned Venice recently. There was a kind of killing off of all the horses in Venice because the horses were getting the plague from the fleas. And then, of course, the fleas decided they needed a new host, and they went into humans and committed the plague. And the same thing with mass killings of cats. That they thought that that would solve the problem. And of course, the fleas just jumped on the people. So they understood that. They had some other rather wackier ideas about disease, including that you could get it to remove itself from the body by enticing it with something that smelled good or driving it away with something that smelled bad. So often a treatment for a disease such as a respiratory illness would be to have you smell something that smelled really good. Meanwhile, you would squat over something burning that smelled bad. And the idea was that the bad smell would enter you through your lower orifices and push the illness towards the nice smelling thing out your upper orifices. Needless to say, is not how medicine works, but it was a lovely idea. But they did understand certain things, so that disease could be transmitted by contact, including contact with things that the sick and dead had touched. So they burned a lot of the bed clothing, the objects that sick people had touched. They didn't understand, however, that washing those things or their hands would reduce the spread. Hygiene was at a fairly low point, unfortunately. Bloodletting or leeching could reduce some of the side effects of the plague that would allow the body to be strong and conquer the pestilence. Bloodletting, even now, or using a leech can reduce a fever really well. But it does, if you do it too much, it of course weakens the person. Other cures, not so much. Rubbing bodies with onions, with dead pigeons, other herbs, the idea of fumigation, which was the one I just described, wearing amulets, those didn't help. And of course, they exposed the practitioner, the medical practitioner, to disease, which was the origin of the plague mask, and an attempt to prevent doctors from inhaling bad air from the patient. So they did have a sense that the air that the patient exhaled was infectious. But one technique that they employed and that did work was quarantine. Walled cities would often close themselves off. Rich would sometimes leave the cities to go to their country estates. Sometimes that was effective, although sometimes then they also brought the illness with them. But if they weren't sick, then that isolation could save them. And there is a plague doctor wearing medieval PPE, and you can see that they look a little odd. Their masks had these long pointed noses. But they did have goggles covering the eyes. They had a sense that this could enter through any orifice of the body. And so this is that famous image of the plague doctor. So wear your mask. Plague doctors would actually take that pointed nose, that bird beak-like quality, and they would fill it with herbs and flowers. Some thought to be medicinal and preventative, others to prevent them from having to smell the rotting corpses of the dead. Some of the herbs that they used were actually effective treatments against the plague, not by smelling it, but by ingesting. Again, because they would lower fever. Willow bark, for instance, is sort of the origin of aspirin, a fever reducer in its natural form, so that if they ingested it, sometimes they could at least treat symptoms enough for the body to recover. Although overall, smelling nice herbs isn't going to help you much. But this has some interesting, not repercussions, but kind of continuing history. The idea that flowers and herbs can prevent infection or illness is a root of the current idea that certain essential oils or flower essences can be curatives. Smelling flowers and smelling essential oils will not prevent COVID-19, as you well know. But some of the traditional roots and herbs do seem to help reduce symptoms of flu and cold viruses, and presumably some of the symptoms of COVID as well. There's a respiratory treatment sometimes called lung qi release. If you get it here, it's usually a tincture or a pill, and it actually does seem to help with some of the respiratory COVID, reduce them, at least in their duration. You have to ingest them, however, not smelling them. This is also reflected in the famous Ring Around the Rosie song. There's some sense that this is a plague song, but the history is a little murky. It's not really attested till fairly well after the plague, but the idea of the pocket full of posies that may help you seems to come from that same idea of what the plague doctors filled their masks with. So now to sort of the area that I am more of a specialist in, which is literature. There are a lot of instances or conversations about the plague itself in the literature of the 14th century. Boccaccio's Decameron takes place during quarantine. A group of rich Florentine youth flee the plague and they go out to the countryside in Fiesole. They spend the time telling stories to each other, which I guess is medieval Zoom. And that constitutes the 100 novellas in the work, the Deca. But it begins with an introduction describing the plague and what it's doing to the city of Florence. And it's sort of interesting. Boccaccio says, "Not such were they as in the East, where an issue of blood from the nose was a manifest sign of inevitable death. But in men and women alike, it was first betrayed itself by the emergence of certain tumors in the groin or the armpits, some of which grew as large as a common apple, others as an egg, some more, some less, which the common folk called givaccioli. And from the two said parts of the body, this deadly gavicciolo soon began to propagate and spread itself in all directions indifferently, after which the form of the malady began to change. Black spots, hence the Black Death, or livid, making their appearance in many cases on the arm or the thigh or elsewhere. Now few and large, then minute and numerous. And as the gavicciolo had been and still were an infallible token of approaching death, such also were these spots on whomsoever they showed themselves, which maladies seemed set entirely at naught both the art of the physician and the virtue of physic. Indeed, whether it was the disorder that was of a nature to defy such treatment, or that the physicians were at fault, besides the qualified, there was now a multitude of both men and women who practiced without having received the slightest tincture of medical science, and being in ignorance of its source, they failed to apply the proper remedies. In either case, not merely were these that recovered few, but almost all within 3 days from the appearance of said symptoms sooner or later died, and in most cases without any fever or attendant malady. So he addresses both what plague looks like and how bad the ability to treat it was. And so here we see a fairly potent illumination of the skeleton riding a skeletal horse kind of around the devastation of the body. And he kind of shows the virulence of the disease as well, talking about how broadly it reached, and how quickly. And it didn't matter how, whether somebody, was poor or rich, that they would die of it. And this is where he talked about the idea that you have to kind of burn the items belonging to a dead person, otherwise you can be infected by them. If you're interested in reading Boccaccio's whole description of the plague, it's at the Fordham Medieval Source Books, and very easy to find online, and quite interesting and detailed. Chaucer, who is an English author contemporary with Boccaccio, also reflects the plague times and their aftermath. He writes his first full well-known work is called The Book of the Duchess. That's about the death of his patron John of Gaunt's wife, Blanche of Lancaster, and she dies of the plague, which he doesn't ever talk about in the poem, but certainly the shadow of the Black Death hangs over the work. Not only did Blanche die, but the wife of King Edward III. So many, many people died during this pandemic who were important. And Chaucer also writes about the wake of the plague in Pardoner's Tale, which is part of the Canterbury Tales. This is a story, if you don't remember it or haven't read it, there are 3 riotous youth who are so distraught at what kind of destruction death has caused that they decide they're going to go out and find death and kill death. Death, they say, 1,000 slain this pestilenza, and in this country all the people slay. So death has killed 1,000 people through this pestilence, through the plague, and in this country it's killed all the people. So this is obviously a response to the plague, as opposed to, say, going and quarantining yourself. So they think they can triumph over death, and of course they can't. They go out, they meet the person who they think might be death, or who says they say, "Are you death?" This is an old man. He says no, but death is under that tree over there. They go and find a tree. It's got buckets of gold underneath it, which is likely a fortune abandoned by someone who had died of the plague. They decide that they're going to keep this fortune. They kind of lose all sight of death, and they want to celebrate. So they send 2 people. They leave 1 person and they send 2 to go get drink. The 2 come back deciding that they're going to poison the other one, but the other one decides he's going to kill them. So he kills them, and then he drinks the poisoned drink, and he dies too. So clearly they found death, but it has killed them. The rioters obviously don't die of the plague, but their attempt to defy it is really a sign of the failure of human vanity in the face of crisis, that there really is nothing that humans can do to prevent this from taking over. It's interesting because Chaucer also reflects the post-plague world in the Nun's Priest's Tale, which is, unless you didn't get it from the picture, about chickens. So it's talking chickens, the best thing ever. But the main chicken, Chanticleer, keeps having these dreams. His wife, Pertolotta, tells him that they're basically pizza dreams and not to worry about them. But indeed, he turns out to be right. There is a fox that is coming to get them. And the fox grabs the main chicken by the throat and is running away. And everybody in the farmyard, the people who own the chickens and all the people around start running after them. And Chaucer describes it, so hideous was the noise of benedicite, certes he Jack Straw and Ismene, nemeda never shootes half so shrille, when that they woulden any Fleming kille, as Vilke day was mad upon the fox. Of brass they brochten bemis and of box, of horn of boon, in which they blew and pauped, and therewithal they shrieked and they pauped, it seemed that as heaven should fall. And what Chaucer's saying here is the noise was so hideous that Jack Straw and his group didn't ever make such a loud noise when they went to kill the Flemings as were made that day in the chasing of the fox. And this is all about noise. They're blowing brass horns and boxwood horns and bones, and they're blowing and crashing them and shrieking and howling. And he says it seemed that heaven should fall. A very apocalyptic image. And it seemed to people of medieval Europe, particularly medieval England, that when the peasants revolted under Jack Straw and marched, first killed a Flemish man, and then marched on London, marching right under the gate at Aldgate where Chaucer lived, up the palace of Richard II, that this was apocalyptic, that suddenly all of the orders and all of the systems that had governed their lives were being upset because peasants aren't supposed to revolt. They aren't supposed to make the demands. They're simply supposed to work the land and die there. They are tied to the land almost as slaves. This Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was also known as the Wat Tyler Rebellion. He and Jack Straw were the leaders. It's clearly generated by the socioeconomic and political tensions that emerge after the pandemic, particularly high taxes and instability in local leadership. So the attempts to collect taxes from these people who were basically starved in the Southeast led many people to kind of rise up in protest. They opened the jails, they sought a reduction in taxes and a living wage and a system of slave labor or serfdom, an end to that, and the removal of certain officials in the law courts. And so they were inspired by sermons by a cleric called John Ball, and they actually marched into London. They set things on fire. They tried to destroy the Savoy Palace, making strong statements about the treatment of laborers and peasants who had no social mobility and very little opportunity to demand anything. Another text that grows out of this has the fabulous name, A Disputation Between the Body and Worms. And so suddenly this consciousness of the body and its decay is very much a part of what people are thinking about. So when the body and the worms talk to each other, the author says it's during a season of great mortality with pestilence reigning and other disease. And so this is really motivated by the plague. And you can read this, you can see that there's this kind of obsession with what's happening to bodies as a result of this. A very different notion of the physical self, which leads to this body of work, both literary and artistic, called Memento Mori. They depict death in various gruesome ways, and the idea is that we're supposed to always remember death. Art and literature, this beautiful, creepy skeleton and this little poem, as soon as we be begun, we then begin to be undone. So the idea that the minute you begin life, you're really basically moving towards death becomes very strong in the popular consciousness. There's the dance of death, the idea that you are led out of your place dancing with skeletons, and that your life, because it's always moving towards death, is is kind of this dance macabre, becomes a very popular form, both in illumination here, and you can see this youth, the handsome youth walking with his falcon, a medieval doctor of physic carrying his beaker of medicines, and they're both being led off by the skeletons, dancing away out of life and into death. And this art form, or this funerary art form, I think is particularly interesting. It's the double tomb, and it portrays the body below, sort of decaying and skeletal, and often covered in maggots or worms or bones, below the body in majesty, as if it's trying to show us what the real body might have looked like in the tomb, and what's really happening beneath this kind of public image of this important person who could commission a major sepulcher. So this really offers a very different notion of the body than existed before. The body becomes an allegory. The decayed body is the real human body, what happens to us all, very much at mercy of the forces of disease and nature and pestilence. And the body on top of the tomb can be considered a representation of the eternal soul, the part of the body that doesn't decay, or the part of the person that doesn't decay, but also sort of a representation of a person's deeds on earth and how they will be remembered in the future, so that you are supposed to strive for a kind of symbolic perpetual body, even as your body is being decayed and eaten by worms. And this idea about the double body becomes very important in subsequent thinking about political leaders, whose bodies are both human and subject to decay, and yet represent a body politic or the nation itself. And one of my favorite places to look at this is in Queen Elizabeth I's speech to the troops at Tilbury. She's well after the 1340s plague, but she represents herself as having the body of a weak and feeble woman, but also the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too. And when she talks about the possible invasion of England, it's represented through the idea of the invasion of her body, which as a female ruler is very, very interesting. So that background on the medieval plague may raise some questions for us, and we can think about what it might tell us today in the middle of our COVID-19 pandemic that isn't really so unprecedented, but feels so disconcerting to all of us. One of the things we might be interested in is thinking about some of the comments that are made about it from a 1349 Chronicle by a fellow called Matthew Knighton. He says, "Lords remit their tenants' rent, whereupon both the magnates of the realm and also lesser lords who had payment of rents, lest their tenants should quit for want of labor and the high cost of living, some half the rent, some more or less, some for 2 years, some for 3, some for 1, according to what they could agree." So one of the things that we know has happened in some cities is rent remitting. Here, obviously, in 1349, this seemed to be a good idea as a way of maintaining tenants, of maintaining a workforce, and maintaining people to actually be able to stay in places so that they can become a workforce when the plague is over. But I think looking at the Black Plague can also give us some interesting causes for optimism in our own COVID moment. It led to, as we said, increased bargaining power. The absence of a population of laborers and land workers allowed them to bargain for increased wages, more reasonable working hours, and rights for laborers. So that might be something we could think about now. Is there a way that this could support and wages for essential and gig workers, especially workers in healthcare, education, food service, and production, all of the things that we've relied on so heavily over these 7 or 8 months, and will continue to do so for, until the vaccine is available. It also led the Black Death to a rise in social mobility. The money-based economy, for any problems that we might have with capitalism itself, certainly allows people to move up and down the social ladder in ways they never could before. So somebody who was resoundingly middle class or from the working class could find ways to make money that would allow them to have different status in society, more buying power, more authority, and other kinds of things. And it also increases the power of people within the government. And I think we can see the ways that a lot of the questions of what is the role of people, such as the popular vote, in the government now and in how the country is run, are similar questions that arose in the 1350s after the Black Death that are arising now. So that there are ways in which we might see parallels between the Black Lives Matter protests from the summer and the Peasants' Revolt, that even if at their very moment they're sort of not producing an immediate result, that they ultimately lead to very profound social changes that allow more mobility, more participation in government, more bargaining power, and more value to people who actually work in our society. I mean, we all work, but who do the kind of work that we have come to depend on in ways that are, I think, we didn't realize we depended on before. Another interesting section from Knighton, I think, is that he says, meanwhile, the king sent proclamations unto all the countries that reapers and other laborers should not take more than they had been accustomed to take under the penalty appointed by statute. So the king is trying to stop this, is trying to reduce the uprisings and reduce the bargaining. But the laborers were so lifted up and obstinate that they would not listen to the king's command. So, okay, enough with the king. But if anyone wished to have them, he had to give them what they wanted and either lose his fruit and crops or satisfy the lofty and covetous wishes of the workmen. Calling them lofty and covetous when they're making, probably about a year seems kind of extraordinary to us. But the sense that there was suddenly real bargaining power, I think, is important. And for the first time, laborers were sort of able to set their own wages because of the increased demand for their work. And one of the things that is interesting in looking at plague histories and some of the, particularly the archaeological work that has been done and some of the genetic work that has been done, is there's a sense that many of the people, particularly of the working classes who survived either because they had some natural immunity or because of a herd immunity, so that the features that also made them die in larger numbers then allowed the stronger ones to survive, which is interesting too. But this may be sort of for the first time that we see a kind of valuing and importance of essential workers. So some questions, because the best part about class in college is always discussion. What changes might come from our current pandemic? And do you think those will or won't reflect the post-Black Death changes seen in Europe? I mean, I've talked about those at some length and done some comparative work in here, but there are other possible changes you might think about too. Will this change our attitudes towards laborers and their value? Will it change the way we view the necessity of healthcare? Might it lead to different kinds of social mobility? And might it, importantly, I began with the statement that the plague was a global phenomenon. It's on every continent in Antarctica. But might that change our thinking about globalization and our recognition of the ways that we're all connected and the ways that we really depend on each other in a global sense, not just in a sort of local or national one? So just a few things for you to think about as we move to discussion. There are things, of course, that we can do. We can read about the Black Death and suggest ways in which it, that suggest the ways in which it brought change, and think about ways that we might sort of lobby for similar things. There are a lot of great works on systematic racism as a contemporary plague. You could read Chaucer and Boccaccio and others who provide a lot of insights into both the past and the present. We can act, we can vote, we can follow our safety practices and wear our PPE. We can learn a lot from the past, and that's a good philosophy of life, I think, not just a philosophy of pandemic. And we can think medieval. And this is something very dear to my heart. Why is the medieval period so evocative for us at the moment? If you watched Game of Thrones or The Viking Show or Reign or any of the many, many medieval television shows or films that have come out in recent years, is there something about that period that speaks to us and to our contemporary problems in a way that's valuable or useful or worthy of investigation? Why the Middle Ages as opposed to other periods? And is there something about that that we might mine or use to understand our present in useful and productive ways? So those are my thoughts. I want to say thank you to all of you for coming in the middle of a Tuesday and probably your lunch break to talk about the Black Death and all of its various, creepiness. and to look at my medieval pictures. I love this double image of it's a chess piece actually, of the queen on the front and the skeleton on the back. Maybe I just like weird, gory stuff, but again, the same image here on the other side of the three young, rich medieval people out there with their falcon and their romance going on. We've got a lady and a knight who are kind of nookieing around, and then their skeletal remains staring at them. So that's what I have to simply say to you. I'm going to stop sharing screen, and hopefully we can have some conversation. So let's see, are there questions? Are there comments? Am I crazy? Yes, Nora.
Yes. Sorry about that. Can you hear me okay?
I can, yes.
I do have a question. The idea of the double tomb,
yes.
It seems also to have some spiritual connotations as well. So where did they place these when they were created? Were they just created by individuals, families, or feudal lords? Were they kept in their own kind of family crypt? Or were these ever placed in any type of spiritual center or church or anything like that? It just seems kind of that duality of, hey, this is what you represent and this is what you really are. It seems to have that spiritual context to it.
It very much has a spiritual context to it. And for the most part, they are in chapels. Often families would have basically built a chapel as part of a church or a cathedral. And it would be sort of like having a sort of what's the word I want, a mausoleum at a fancy cemetery now, and that all of the family would be buried there, at least the most important people. But you'd have to be pretty rich to have even this kind of a tomb in the first place. So you would be able to buy or kind of take possession of a chapel. So they tended to be in chapels, side chapels on larger churches. They are generally members of the nobility, occasionally bishops who would then be buried in the main church. So these are people who can afford to be buried in the church. Most people are buried in the churchyard outside. So one of the funniest things about this, which is not related to the double tomb, but is related to Chaucer, who we talked about, is that Chaucer was buried at Westminster Abbey because that was his parish church when he died, but he's buried in the churchyard somewhere. And when they decided to build the Poet's Corner, they just picked a 14th century tomb and decided it was Chaucer's. He did not have the buying power to get inside a church. You had to be very rich. And there is a double tomb at the cloisters at the Metropolitan Museum if you want to see one. They're pretty fascinating. But yes, there's definitely a very strong spiritual component that, the body will rot away, but the spirit is what's important. And that's what you need to nurture and make valuable. And what was, I think, in some ways, even because you'd expect that from a tomb, what to me strikes me as interesting is the sort of secular component, that to make yourself remembered by people on earth, you have to be good and kind of inhabit that spiritual body as opposed to just the rotting physical body. And so many of those Memento Mori images, like the last two, particularly the one of the three young people and then their skeletons, it's like if you just spend your life in revel, you're just going to be the skeleton. Your kind of spiritual body is not going to be representable. It's going to vanish. So yeah, that's very, very spiritual. But of course, the separation of the life of the spirit and the life of the secular person is much less separate in the Middle Ages than it is now. People really, those two things were really very much more interwoven. And you see it in everything from Dante's Divine Comedy, where, it's half political and sticking all of his political enemies in hell, but it also has a very strong spiritual message that these things don't separate really until the Reformation in Western Europe. Or in any part of Europe, really. In Christian Europe, I guess, is the right way to say that. You start seeing a separation between the secular and the religious sides of life. Thank you. That's a great question.
Angela, this is Sandro. I know someone asked if you could repost the Boccaccio link.
Yes.
In your presentation.
Let me see.
That's a good question. If you
slide.
Right.
And see if I can copy the link and then paste it in the chat.
I think that's the way to do it.
All right. Yes. All right. Let's see. I've got copied the link. And let's see. Here's the chat. Yes. And so here it is. Oh yeah, there it is. All right,
There
there
it
we
is.
go. Great.
Perfect.
And if you just look for Fordham Medieval Sourcebook Boccaccio, it will pop up. But it's a really fascinating read. The descriptions of the plague are just fascinating. And it's really considered one of the best descriptions, the most thorough descriptions that we have. Any other questions before you head off to the rest of your day?
Well, I have one final question for you, Angela, and
Sure.
just in regards to teaching this specific class to your students, what is their overall reaction? I mean, are they enamored with what happens in medieval times, or is it more, correlation to what's going on now, specifically what happened in the past?
I have not taught this specific class to my medieval students, but I taught the medieval literature class last spring, and I was teaching it as a global medieval class. And of course, we went out on quarantine in the middle of that semester, which led to our talking more about the connections between then and now. And I think students often are very interested in the Middle Ages through things like Game of Thrones and the Viking show and all these medieval movies. When they get to the real Middle Ages and read the literature and find that it's even more wacko and even more interesting, and still has so much to say to us and so much to say to our present moment, that they get very excited about it. The Middle Ages that I was taught in some ways was still somewhat dusty and distant, but work that's been done in the field since I was in graduate school 100 years ago has really opened up the kind of fascinating elements of the period in the ways that it talks about everything we care about. That whether it's talking about the environment, they have a kind of interesting way of thinking about the world that they live in and how what their responsibilities to it are and are not, or whether it's thinking about what constitutes a human and what it means to be human in a world that centers very differently than our own sense. And that comes partly from understandings of cosmology and also, again, a different worldview, how you deal with one's inner psychology, so that in a contemporary novel, people have psychologies much like our own. But in a medieval novel, if you've got a psychological problem, you turn it into a knight and you kill it. You joust against it. Exterior. So I think I'm fascinated by the ways that people who are in so many ways very much like themselves understand the world very differently and yet care about the same things. So that's often my students' response. I see another hand. Is that
yes, Dr. Forrest Pritchett? Yeah.
Hello, Dr. Forrest Pritchett.
I'm just a friend. I don't have to come too formally. Angela, I just wanted to compliment you on the presentation, and particularly toward the end of it when you did indicate how we can use classical paradigms for understanding contemporary issues, because so many of us find it so difficult in this country to do any analysis of the scope of, like, let's say, systemic racism. But when you pointed out that indeed we all, as Dr. King once said, we may have come here in different boats, but we're all in the same boat at the present time. But I took up similar procedures during the spring semester with students, just to indicate that this is an uncharted piece of water for all of us. But on the other hand, we do have historical accounts that we can look at.
Yeah.
And I actually had our students do that for about a 60-day period, so that by the end of April, we were able to look at what lessons can we learn. And at that point in time, most of the students, for example, had never heard of what we would call the Spanish epidemic, or the early 20th century. And they were just amazed by the fact that millions of people had died. I said, well, do you remember even reading about the Black Plague in high school?
Yeah.
What did you think that was all about? But anyway, just wanted to thank you for your thoroughness. And
I just dropped two books that are very, very worth reading into the chat and very readable. They're not just for dusty medievalists like me. Geraldine Heng's The Invention of Race in the European Middle Ages, which is a fabulous, globe-changing, thought-changing, paradigm-changing book. And Colin Platt's King Death, which I think is one of the most readable sort of histories of the Black Plague. And very interesting, very fun. Well, not fun, but fascinating. So I like to read stuff, so maybe you like to read stuff. There are some suggestions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. And I see
I hope
somebody.
I hope we all pass the course this afternoon.
A+.
A+.
Then
Everyone
Emil.
will be on the dean's list next semester.
Absolutely.
Hello.
Hi, Ben. How are you?
Pretty good. It's a pleasure to be back in class with you.
Lovely to have you back.
Well, so one thing that I've been wondering about is it seems like our sense of time has shifted and that we're going to be in COVID times forever.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure our medieval friends thought this was raging all around them. But I want to sort of look to the afterwards. Do you see, is there like a shift to some sort of light at the end of the tunnel where the literature or the art becomes happier or more joyful or more positive once they travel through this great tragedy and their lives and their politics and their cultures and been transformed by this experience?
I think yes, that you do. I think there's a sort of an interesting balance between, sort of this is over, which is great. People are not driving 5 minutes, but the world is now changing. So there's a sort of enthusiasm, but unsettledness. Chaucer writes during and then after the plague, and you see very much a sort of strong sense, I think, of fun and energy and liveliness in the Canterbury Tales, but there's also a kind of concern underlying that the world is changing, that different people are having, are moving in different ways. So it's a transitional time. And I think you then get to a kind of sense of stability and optimism sort of post-medieval period, that the changes that happen to move towards, what we call the Renaissance or early modern period lead to a kind of optimism. So yes, I think that you will see, you do see that shift in sense of time. Like there's this big scary time, and then there's this sort of diminishing of it, and then there's the time when that's not happening. So yeah, I think that you do, and you do see a kind of energy. But what's interesting too is if you look at Boccaccio's Decameron, there's this incredible lively energy right in the middle of it, as if we have to value the life that we have and be energetic and enthusiastic and positive about it, which is fascinating to me. I mean, a lot of the stories in the Decameron are very cheerful.
Something positive to focus on, perhaps.
I think so. And a sense that if you have your life, you should value it and live it well becomes an issue too. And also balanced with some of the like eat, drink, and be merry because tomorrow we die stuff.
Well, thinking maybe that's something we can think about as we continue on to the winter.
Yeah, exactly. And to maybe find some value in the stories that you might want to tell about this time too.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Weisl. This was an amazing presentation of Black Death and pandemics now. And I really appreciate your time and your wonderful talent. And you are a treasure to our school. And I really appreciate you providing this class to our parents and alumni and some of our students. And again, this session was recorded and we'll be able to provide it to our total Seton Hall community hopefully in 30 minutes on our on-demand page. And so thank you again. Thank you everyone for joining us. We do have some wonderful sessions today. I posted them on the chat. So please join us. I know there's at 1:30 today, so in about 30 minutes, we'll have what's called Family and Genealogy Workshop. So this event will introduce basic techniques and some advanced strategies for the Seton Hall community to explore in order to build their very own family history tree. So that should be exciting as well. And then today we'll have another back to school class with Professor Mark Shield. And it'll be basically joining his class, what's called the Student Portfolio Management class, where you can learn what it is like to turn a real portfolio. So that should be interesting. And then later on in the evening at 6:30, we have our second session of How I Got Here discussion with Seton Hall parent Michael Smith, who's the Associate Director of Clinical Education at Boston University's Physician Assistant Program. So we're excited today. There's a lot going on, and especially this week. So Thank you again. Thank you all, and go Pirates.
Oh, Pirates. Thank you
Yes.
all so much. It's so nice to see some former students, colleagues, and people I don't know. And I just think that Seton Hall can't do anything better than encourage learning. And I'm so glad you all decided to come and hang out and do some back classing with me today. It was a great pleasure. Thanks so much for listening and for caring about the past.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Bye, Lillian.
Thank you, Sandro.
Bye.
Take
I
care.
can't wait to see you again someday.
I hope so soon.
Good to see you, Beth. Take care.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much for this. This was lovely.
Thank you so much. It was so lovely to get to hang out with you guys and talk. I love this stuff.